exam the day following? Probably because some of you will not be staying in this class once the review begins, because I'll go around and you haven't got the work here or done. I'm going to go over a number of things to do with the exam ahead of time. The format of the exam, and you should take this down. Okay.
You have to go. You do it too?
Questions to make 25, no, to make 26 marks. You get 26 out of 25. I don't think any of the questions are 2 marks. I think they're all 1 mark questions. Some questions you can get a half a mark off, or half a mark on. You can get a half a mark out of it. At the end, if you get a mark like 19 and a half out of 25, I raise it to 20. Okay, so there's no problem if you don't think you know the whole answer. Write down what you do know, and you might get a half a mark that might be bumped up to a full mark. Okay? There are approximately half the questions are multiple choice. Either 14 or 13 questions, I can't remember. Sometimes I put 14 on just because it's easier to mark. Multiple choice is easier to mark than longer answer. They will be spread out over every lecture if they're on the lectures of classroom material. And if they're on the readings, they'll be spread out over the 4 sheets of readings. Okay. So you can expect that at least 1 question per sheet of reading, and one question will double up. My questions usually end up being more complicated than your questions, and your questions tend to be, and it doesn't really matter, I don't mind, it doesn't matter. This is just an exercise to force you to look at the material before you want to force you to try to decide what's important in the material. Otherwise you'd all be doing it the night before the exam, and there would be no point in teaching, because you've got to learn to use your frontal lobes, think ahead, figure out what's coming down the track before it hits you in the face tomorrow. So, my questions will probably have 3 bits of information. Whereas your question may have covered 1 thing on the question sheet, my question will cover 3 different questions on the question sheet, reading question sheet, okay? So you'll see a combination of information. You'll find my question slightly more difficult because it requires you to learn to know 3 things instead of 1 thing, usually. Some of you will have made the other types of questions. If you looked at the examples that I gave you, you might have. I'm not insistent about that. And also, it's got to be a pretty, well, let's just stick with the exam, not the multiple choice assignment. Okay. So there will be 40% of the questions on the reading, the classroom material. No, wait a minute, 60% of the classroom material. That means likely more questions on it. And 40%, which is 10 to 12 questions on the readings. Okay? So if you want to divide it up between the 2, slightly more questions on the classroom material. I stress classroom material for 1 reason. I want you here. I don't see how you can learn by staying away. If you think that you're going to learn something by not being in the class with the teacher that's teaching you, it's a huge mistake. This still is the most efficient way to learn things. You reading a book is not going to be as good as me telling you about 10 books and breaking it down for you and categorizing and doing all the things, okay? You have a unique opportunity here, even though you don't realize it. All your teachers are overeducated. Doesn't say they're greatly educated, but they are overeducated. They have graduate degrees. Many of them went on to do PhDs because they couldn't get a job, because there's too many academics in the world. And so they have an extensive knowledge usually of what they're teaching. And, unlike high school teachers who are elementary school. And I'm not putting down high school teachers or elementary school teachers. I'm not. I'm saying they don't tend to have the same body of knowledge. They may actually have more teaching skills because they've probably taken courses in education, which is possible. Okay? And also, you know what my point of view of education is? You take the best money, the highest salaries should go to the people that start the kids off. If you've got the kids learning and liking learning in elementary school, you have solved the problem of education. I look out there and look at my students, and they are zombies, absolute zombies. They've been in education for so many years, and they're on this conveyor belt to nowhere. They have developed all kinds of strategies for avoiding their own education. You know, it's just amazing. And then we get them here, and we give them more courses than any other level of education. We give them 7, 8 courses, when at university you will seldom get that many. We basically tell them, be mediocre. Just touch everything, okay? Because you don't have enough time in the day. And also we've done studies, and we all realize that most of you, what is the term? Sabotage your own education by having too much work time, for whatever reason. Some people need to work, other people need to buy things. And it's really interesting. The time you actually do for your studies is actually quite small. Okay, so basically the whole course has been designed to reward you for being here, things written on the board and spelled correctly, that you were basically told assignments in class such as Piltdown, Oaks, a couple you're going to get today, things pointed out to you, you know, and you're going to see all those things in the exam. It's one of those things. If you showed up, I think it was Woody Allen, the great pedophile, who actually said, part of success is just showing up. You actually showed up to class and took down notes and maybe were able to somehow by looking at them more than once get them in your head. Okay, so this is a massive attempt to get you through the first exam. It's not a lot of material compared to the rest of the course. So that's why I told you, do it up front. Do your best effort up front while you're fresh, because the semester is just way too long in the winter, and people just disappear. If they're in class, they actually disappear in their minds somewhere. You know, about April, you look at them and you go, oh, Christ, they're finished. Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to reward those that did the work and not reward those that didn't do the work. That's all. It's not vendetta. It's nothing personal. And if you were a teacher, you'd probably say, well, that sounds fair. Okay. So, yes?
What if you did it but you forgot your book?
I told you, it's the same thing as not doing it. You know, we're not, this is not, okay, how many brought your book today? Thank you. Okay, it's one of those things, we can't duplicate your notes, we can't bring your notes for you, okay? Just so don't go anywhere, we're not finished yet, okay? I mean, and I think I stated this at least 12 times in the semester, it's the same thing as not bringing it, okay? And unfortunately, people need to learn the hard way. And I have to be the one that says no, okay? That's my job. And if you're going into education, that's your job in education. Saying, no, what you're doing is not going to work. You have to do it this way. And it's amazing. If you don't stick to it, people will just continue doing whatever screwed up thing they think is going to work, okay? So, let's see now. Okay, so when we go through the review today, the purpose is for me to answer questions about things you didn't understand or you didn't get. So you're allowed to miss a question here and there, okay? But when you start missing pages of questions, that's when you don't get to stay. If you didn't do the work or don't have it here, it's not showing that you're interested or even trying to be a student, okay? I will add an extremely large bit of information, okay? because the book makes mistakes. I love it when it makes mistakes. I don't know who chose this book. It makes a lot of mistakes, okay? And by you understanding what the mistake is, you actually learn something. If you can see something, say, that's wrong, and this is why it's wrong. That's the first step in education. And I will add extra material because they need examples in here to illustrate points. And if I'm going to the bother of adding material and writing it on the board so you can spell it correctly on the exam, I suggest you take it down and study it. Okay? Now, anybody who doesn't have this done or hasn't brought their material to class, the good news is we're only going to cover 2 of the readings today, and they're the shorter readings. So, you probably could talk to some friend about boring their notes at the end, but there's no way you can stay if you haven't bothered to bring your goods or you haven't done it. So, what I want you to do is I want you to get out your book, and I want you to show me in your book where you have done it, and we will do it up to question 20. The most valuable lesson. That's the question. Education is a tough thing sometimes. Wait till you get to university. It's peachy keen. Okay, let's look at this. Questions 1 through 5. Anything you didn't get? What we do is we go through it first. I try to find out things you didn't get, and then we'll go back through it and I'll point out the likely extra material. Okay? So, 1 through 5, anything you didn't get? 1 and 2. What is included in the goals of anthropological research? That's question 1. Okay, this is on the first chapter, right here, the goals of anthropological research, second paragraph, page, what anthropologists study? In my book, it's 2, it could be another page in your book. What is it?
No, for us, the questions is
No.
Okay, we're getting, okay. What is your question? Okay, the first question. Oh, okay. Okay, we're starting at 3. The first 2 questions we won't worry about. They're not supposed to be there. I don't have no idea why they're on repeat. Were you creative? Good. I just pump it off the computer and I got here this semester. I gave everybody my phone number, which is 1306. It's not 1306. I find out that in one semester they've changed my phone number to 4445. And I'm sure that's why I haven't gotten many phone calls. Oh, good. Nobody can find me. So, I mean, things happen. So, those first 2. No, okay, we go to question number 3 then, which is, what is included in the goals of anthropological research? So those are the ones you couldn't find? Those are actually 2 questions off of the net of chapter 2, of reading 2. Okay, those are the first 2 questions that were in there, and they are an old copy, yes? Sure, you can, sure. Homework, do you have an assignment to hand in? Or you should put it in there quickly. And then you're going to take out your textbook and show me that you've done the work. Okay? Okay, so let's go on. What is the Greek? Okay. First 2 don't count. 3 to 5, I guess, whatever it is on your sheet. 3 to 5? Nothing. Okay, 7 to 12. They should be all the same by now. 7 to 12. Anything you didn't get? Okay, 12 to 20, anything you didn't get? Fairly straightforward. So just show me. Just show me where you open it up. Show me where you underlined or highlighted. Okay, go.
Sir, sure. Can you go over the answer for 12?
Okay, cultural anthropology is a what? Okay.
No, that's not ours.
Okay, what is your question 12?
Others incorporate.
Others incorporate applied into each of what? Okay, 11? Or what your 12 is? Okay, 12. Okay, this is the bottom of the paragraph. This is the first paragraph, which starts, still have man as a root. That's not it. Then there's the paragraph, this text will follow. Look at the last line in that paragraph. This text will follow the basic organization. Look at the last line in that paragraph. Whereas others, okay, many anthropologists add applied anthropology to this list as a fifth field of study. Whereas others incorporate applied anthropology into each of anthropology's subfields. Okay? So what happens is, this is one of those nether worlds of, it depends on the anthropologist. And it's not a big point. Since they've had textbooks, they've been talking about using applied anthropology as the fifth major subfield of anthropology. Some people say you don't need to, it's part of every other field. Okay, so it's just an opinion thing. I think that applied anthropology has been on the verge of becoming one of the major subfields for 20 years, and it hasn't made it yet. So it's just that who you talk to will tell you. So very often applied anthropology happens in the field anyways. There's a question about why we study anthropology, and I think most anthropologists study anthropology so that they can apply it to human behavior, solve problems. And that's applied anthropology. Okay? So we will refer to it as the possible fifth major subfield, applied anthropology. But remembering, it's not the real subfield yet. It's the possible one. And then I'll show you examples where applied anthropology comes into play. Lots of them. Okay, why study something if you're not going to use it? I did have an archaeology professor who actually said he studied archaeology because it was irrelevant to everything. And I thought the way he taught it, it certainly was irrelevant. Okay? All he wanted to do was dig up bones and find them and label them. And do, dig up things out of the ground. And I thought, yep, he's really reduced it to getting things out of the ground. Period. And so you actually do those things to get information. Very often the information can be used to solve problems. If we know what went on in the past, we can tell what's happening today and whether or not we've treated it with the appropriate solutions, okay? Okay, so that's, did you get that answer then?
Yeah.
Remember, it's your 12? That's your 12? That's her 12.
It was
Okay.
11, but yeah.
Okay, it doesn't matter who, okay, is that your 12? Is anybody? So down to 20, anything? 20, okay, 20 must be, what does the process leading to generalizations involve? Is that correct? Okay. Okay, this is not, okay, there is at the top of, I don't know what page it's on in your book, but it has a darkened ethnography, the word darkened ethnography. Go down to the end of that paragraph, okay? And 2 lines below the end of that paragraph in the next paragraph, which is ethnology, the process leading to these generalizations involves explaining the similarities and differences in cultures. Okay? Is that it? Okay? Good. All right. Now, 21, what do you have, up to 23 on your sheet or 24?
24.
You have up to 24? Okay, up to 21 to 24. Anything you didn't get? Okay. Now, things that you should know. We've skipped one, okay, you have a 1 and 2, which I have is a 3 and 4, I think. Okay? Is your 1 or 2? The first thing you should know what the goals of anthropological research are. You should know what anthropologists are trying to do, but I'm not going to give you a question on that. It seems rather obvious, okay? What an the study of human beings. We're looking at anything that people do, human behavior. We're looking at the human behavior to try to solve problems, okay? Now, we get into possible question material when we start talking about the Greek derivation of the word anthropology, okay? Which means the study or science of man. Okay? You should know that it's Greek and not Latin, because I could easily put in an A, B, or C. Oh, the Chinese derivation of the word, you know. It's based on Greek. So don't circle the one that says Latin or Chinese or Arabic. Okay? And the fact that it is the science of man indicates that that was the state of the culture at that time. Men counted, women didn't. Okay. And so today we now call it the study or science of human beings or human beings. Humans. All right. And so we've changed the term to get rid of the sexist bias. And that almost is always in some form an A, B, or C one. Derivation means the word originates in a word that is Greek that means something. And so you should know what it literally means. Okay. Science or study of man. And you should know the text definition, but I'm not going to ask you for the definition of either of them, but you should know what it means in Greek, because that's actually the basis of the word. Derivations are very often questions on exams, because when we use words, we often get away from their original meaning. They take on connotations which are completely different. When we use the word civilization, we are dealing with a word that is actually quite racist. It's to people who consider themselves civilized and others not, are really telling them we have a justification for conquering and exploiting people. And so there are certain words we just don't use anymore because they have a very bad meaning. They've taken on a meaning that has a whole bunch of loaded information, sentiment attached. And we don't use those words because they now mean something they weren't intended to mean. So for instance, civilization in anthropology is actually a precise type of society, a state, S-T-A-T-E, with an unequal class structure. That's what we define it as. It's not all the other things that are loaded on in the definition. The fact that they have a course called, in history, Western civilization is one of the reasons I got out of history, quite honestly. Because if you ask everybody that was conquered by the Europeans, which was for 3-4 centuries in the world, I don't think they think the Europeans are very civilized, quite honestly. Okay. What are the 4 major subfields of anthropology as recognized by the American Anthropological Association? We should put, if they had a theme, we'd sing the theme to the American Anthropological Association, the greatest organization of anthropology in America. You should know that. And you should know some things that differentiate the two. And you should know which 3 are all concerned with aspects of culture. And of course, Sesame Street trained you well. One of these is not like the other. Multiple choice questions are, one of these is not like the other. And so, you really should know which one is not considered to be related to culture. And that, of course, is biological or physical. So there's usually a question to that point on the exam to see if an A, B, or C, whether you know it's true or false. Okay? Now, I would argue with that point of view, because as I said, we talked about a mass burial dug up in Britain after a battle, and all these people that were buried were male, and they all had the same thing. They had an immensely large wrist on one side compared to a small wrist on the other side. So in their lifetime, they had developed this massive wrist. The bone had grown to handle the stress. And of course, these were bowmen. They were the guys that could kill knights at a distance through armor. And of course, when one side won, they killed all the bowmen on the other side. Or, this gesture today goes back to the Middle Ages. When bowmen were in a battle which they won, they walk around like this because they still had their fingers, because the other side would chop them off so they couldn't use the bow. Okay, so the next time you give somebody the finger, just remember, you're a bowman that hasn't lost their fingers yet. Okay? And you thought it meant something else. Well, meanings change. It's sort of the same thing, but not quite. You should know which is also called physical anthropology. And physical anthropology, before genetics showed up and it started becoming biological anthropology, which is going to just break all the information boundaries. You know, it's going to be amazing what we're going to learn through genetics. We're already learning things we just had no idea about. Cultural anthropology, physical anthropology didn't have genetic studies when I started. Not many of them anyway. It was in its infancy. And so they used comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. You looked at parts of the anatomy of the fossil that you found, and you compare it to parts of the anatomy of another fossil to see if they were of the same group. Because within any population there's a similarity in the size, the shape of certain parts of our anatomy. Yes?
This was for
Physical anthropology, which preceded biological anthropology, and then they merged together under the name biological anthropology because, of course, that's going to be the coming thing. If you really do have to get degrees in biology if you're going to do forensic anthropology and biological anthropology. And as I say, I have a student at Vanderbilt now doing graduate work in it. But she had to switch her field from social science to physical to biology and then take social science courses. Okay? So you should know about cultural anthropology and the definition, but I'm not going to ask you the definition. You may have to apply it. And there is a definition in what I call the box. What is it here? It's a square, the box is those things that, how all these textbooks like to put things in the margin. It's the latest thing in textbooks. They don't just write. They figure this somehow doesn't confuse students and makes it more, I have no idea what they do. But anyways, that's what they do now. Okay? Now, okay, so let's see if there's anything. Let's go to applied anthropology. I want to give you one example that I usually give. We looked at other examples. There's a glaringly huge, very early, very, very early in the history of anthropology, in the 1940s, a huge example of applied anthropology. Because some people will say, oh, anthropology doesn't know anything. Well, that's crap. we got so much data, it's unbelievable, okay? And that's one of the reasons I got out of history. History would talk about things, but not knowing the facts. That's what I loved about history. They just, they just took anybody's opinion as somehow gospel. In the 1930s, there were several empires on the Pacific that were facing each other. the Americans had managed to grab the Philippines, Hawaii, and other places which were not part of their nation. They grabbed them militarily. The Philippines were a colony. Hawaii was annexed and eventually would become a state rather later. But it was all seized by American troops, overthrowing local governments. Actually, Hawaii at one time was the Sandwich Islands, which was a colony of Britain. The British moved out. They left the local Polynesian queen as the queen as in England. She was the figurehead of a parliament. They moved out. They allowed American planters, Dole Pineapple and people like that to move in. They decided they didn't like the local government and they kicked up a storm. The Marines invaded and they conquered Hawaii. The U.S. president hadn't even ordered it. He said, what happened? You overthrew the government of Hawaii and we now hold it? Of course, he didn't give it back. And we said, well, gee, that's really bad, but I'm not giving it back. We'll keep it. Okay? So Hawaii was the crown of the American military in the Pacific. It's where the Pacific Fleet was all based in the sitting duck to a Japanese attack. The Japanese were expanding into Southeast Asia and having really good success at beating up on the French who controlled Indochina and the British which controlled Malaysia. And why the Japanese were expanding into that area was largely for petroleum. It's a huge area producing petroleum. And without petroleum, the Japanese were going to be in serious trouble because they couldn't power their airplanes, they couldn't power their ships. And as they were expanding, to stop them from expanding, the first step that the Americans did, which was an unofficial declaration of war, is they cut off all American sources to petroleum. So when we talk about Pearl Harbor and the Japanese sneak attack in 1941 at Pearl Harbor, the war had already been declared economically. The U.S. refused to sell petroleum to Japan, and given that ultimatum, it was clear that the Japanese were going to attack them somewhere. It's just the Americans didn't realize they were going to attack Hawaii. Okay? And so, the United States found itself in a war which it had ill-prepared itself for. In fact, a lot of the Japanese officers were trained at West Point. They had an exchange program. So some of the major officers in the Japanese military had actually had American training and knew who they were fighting. But somebody in the American government had their head screwed on properly. Okay? And realized they didn't understand the Japanese, a culture that was totally different than the Americans. Okay? And it just so happened that anthropology was developing in American universities, and it was taught in some of them. And so they hired an anthropologist to write a report on what they could expect of the Japanese culture and any strategy that the Japanese culture would lead to in the war they were about to fight. The anthropologist was Ruth Benedict. And she did a report that eventually became, after the war, or later in the war, a book, because it was that well written. And the book was called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And it talked about Japan and its culture, beliefs, and what they could expect the Japanese to do. It's too bad they hadn't had the report before they cut off the petroleum, because they would have known. The Japanese did the same thing in 1905 against the Russians. They defeated the Russians in a naval battle by sneaking in and attacking them before the Russians were ready. So if they'd have done any of their homework before they started cutting off oil, they might have known what was going to happen. The Japanese were not going to take it lying down. Okay? And so, this book became famous in anthropology after it was published, but it was initially funded by the Department of Defense in the United States because somebody was smart enough to figure out, we don't understand these guys, we're gonna be in real trouble fighting them unless we figure out their culture. And this book may have helped lead to the dropping of the nuclear weapons, the atom bomb or the hydrogen bomb, I can't remember, atom or hydrogen, on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Because it got to a certain point in the war where the Americans were losing thousands of troops in attempts to take small islands to get close to Japan. And they estimated if they invaded Japan, because Japan would never, it's dishonorable in the Bushido Code to surrender. You die. When you sign up for the military, you give your life to the emperor, who is a god. And you are supposed to die. You don't get captured. And this is why the Japanese treated prisoners so badly, is because they were non-people. They were a disgrace. Enemy prisoners were a disgrace. You fought to the death. And if you didn't fight to death, you committed suicide. Okay? And so, the Japanese were going to fight and fight and fight. And the Americans finally decided, probably after reading this book and experiencing how many of them were dying on the small islands just getting to Japan, they estimated 1 million American soldiers would die if they invaded. So they dropped the bombs. And the first bomb didn't work. No, I mean, they dropped the bomb. It annihilated, I forget, Nagasaki, or it just knocked it flat. You've seen pictures of it. And the Japanese still didn't surrender. So they dropped the second. It was amazing. And so, the chrysanthemum and the sword, applied anthropology, used by the Department of Defense to decide strategy against the Japanese in World War II. Okay? And whoever thought about going to an anthropology was quite smart, because there was a certain psychological prejudice in Japanese culture that you could actually get the Japanese to commit suicide if you knew their culture. Their famous form of attack was the massive charge into death. It was like to die in battle, massively charging into death was considered the most honorable way to go. And so if you could set up a situation where that occurred, it was totally to the detriment of the Japanese military. And one of the problems that they had when the Japanese were defending the islands going in is the generals had to stop their soldiers from attacking. They had to actually make sure that soldiers wouldn't attack in order to hold defensive lines, because that was the code. We die in battle. And so it was very interesting when they applied this, and it really probably did a lot to stop the excessive killing that would have gone on if it had continued anyway. And so Ruth Benedict wrote the book. I've never read the book, but I hear it's quite interesting. It's a psychological study and a cultural study of what to expect from the Japanese by looking at their culture. The chrysanthemum and the sword. Okay? Okay. Now we go down to a book entitled Tribal. Okay, what are the two traditional areas of focus within cultural anthropology? We did the lecture on ethnography and ethnology. You do know that you are going to get one question that says, which has to be in a sentence, and you're going to have to write down the title is before you give either a title of an ethnology or a title of an ethnography. And these have to be made up by you. They can't be based on a real group of people, so that I know that you understand the concept and the difference between the two concepts. So you make up two of them ahead of time, one that's an ethnology title, one that's an ethnography title. I lectured on it the last day. And you will get one and the other class will get the other. Okay, you don't know which one you're going to get, but by doing it you will show. And actually people do it so poorly I give it to on exam 2, there's probably the same question. And people still get it wrong on exam 2. I have no idea why, it's one of the easiest concepts there is. Okay, but, what can I say? I have no reason why people haven't done their work and they're in class either. I don't get that one. Maybe I didn't mention it? Stress that point? So, we did the lectures on ethnography and ethnology. If you didn't get the lectures, I suggest you basically read all about ethnography and ethnology, okay? The key point is that ethnography is the gathering of descriptive data through participant observation on the part of ethnographers or anthropologists that go to small cultural units and live with them or visit them regularly to collect that information. So you have all these ethnographies you could fill the whole school with, and from these ethnographies we get the data from which to make up conclusions, theories, generalizations about culture and behavior by comparing the data in societies that are similar or different. Okay, so the ethnography is the data collection, the ethnology is the comparison of those data collections. And as I say, you could fill a building this size easily with the number of ethnographies that have been done. When you think about it, any description of any group of people, any time in the history of the planet, or the existence of the planet, is an ethnography. Many Hollywood movies are ethnographies. They may be actors, but they're portraying a certain type of culture at a certain period. And some of them are quite accurate. Okay? And in fact, some of the movies that got the most awards probably got the awards because they were the closest to being real about the culture they were dealing with and explaining things. Okay? So you know that question's on the exam. You have been warned. The answer will have to be in a question in a sentence. So you always write down the title is. And if you don't do that, you don't get the mark. If it doesn't get answered in a sentence, just having the title is not good enough. And I'll tell you this now, and I'll still get people that will just put down the title and what the answer is. Okay? A book entitled Tribal Economics would be what? Well, it would be an ethnology. It compares units. It's not a description of one unit, cultural. It's comparison of different tribal economies or similar tribal economies. Now, the word tribal, okay, is not to be used in anthropology. You'll see books with it in it. It's an old term that we have currently dropped. We now use village society instead of tribal. The reason for this is it, once again, is taken on a connotation that means more than it really means. In anthropology, it's a certain type of society based on very strict kinship that's larger than a band and smaller than a chiefdom. Doesn't mean anything to you yet, but you're going to learn this. Okay? But when you listen to the press, and I remember hearing this, at the time when the war was going on in the Balkans and each side was massacring each other, you get on the news, American news. It is a tribal conflict about the people that lived in the Balkans. Now, what does that say? Well, they weren't tribes of people. Technically speaking, they were complex societies. Okay? They weren't simple tribes. The reason they used the word tribes was to say it was senseless. Tribal people do senseless things. They kill each other in revenge, one for the other. It's sort of like the Hatfield and McCoys. You kill one of mine, I kill one of yours. You kill one of mine, I kill one of yours. An eye for an eye and all that jazz. So the word tribal is taken on a connotation, a meaning that is more than it was meant to mean in anthropology. So we just dropped the word. Now some of you will have put it, because you saw it in the book, into your questions. That's okay. I'm not going to take a mark off it if I've got your multiple choice questions and you use tribe. Just be aware of this. It's like not calling a monkey an ape, which really shows you know nothing about primatology. Don't use the word tribe. Okay? And it's just a convention that, and you'll find teachers that still use it. Or people that still, it's still in books out there that I've seen, but we don't use it anymore. And the fact that this is called Tribal Economies, it means it must be an older book that's describing, an older ethnology. So you should know the definitions of ethnology and ethnography, but the question on this one is actually given to you in last class. You have to come up with a title of each. It has to be in examples. And I would suggest, seeing I gave it to you earlier, you prepare it ahead of time. You don't wait till you see it in the exam and go, oh, I think I'll make up a title now. You know? It's like, be premeditated. It's not cheating to think ahead, okay, when you have prior knowledge. And the reason I give you these questions is so that you don't waste your time in the exam. Because the exam has little enough time as it is, okay? All right, so now you can take out your questions. What are we at on the next sheet? Reading 2. What are we at?
25.
Sorry?
25.
25. Okay, we're back to where I'm caught up with you. 25 on. Okay, just show me your stuff from 25 on, if you could. Okay. Got it done? Got it done? Got it done? Okay. Got it done? Okay. Got it done? Okay. Got it done? Got it done? Okay. Got it done? Got it done? Good, good, good. Got it done? Good, good. Got it done? Good. I like purple. Got it done? Great. Let's see. 25 to 29. Anything you didn't get? Okay, 30 to 35. Anything you didn't get? 34. What was Indiana Jones not? Why was Indiana Jones not really an anthropological? And you should scratch out anthropologist, put archaeologist. Which is probably why you couldn't answer that one. So anthropological 34. Anthropological archaeologist, not anthropological anthropologist. I don't know what the secretary was thinking that day. I hadn't taken her out for lunch and she hadn't drank wine. So. I'll let you. Okay, the long and the short of it, he is a classical archaeologist. A classical, you know, like classical pianist. In, I guess from the 1700s, 1800s into the 1900s, education at universities was elite. The people of the upper class went to universities, and the people of the real upper class, lords and ladies, went to the best of universities, Cambridge, Oxford, things like that. And at that time, it was considered that the center of civilization was Europe, and that the Greeks, for some reason, and even the Egyptians who didn't live in Europe, they lived in Africa, but that was just a technicality. They were still part of Western civilization. You know, you can't be prejudiced against them. They built pyramids, they must be good. Was Greece. And so you got this incredible curriculum which started with all the dead Greek, you know, thinkers, philosophers, a lot of dead Greeks. And that was what made a young person, usually male, because there weren't many women getting an education at university. They were training the elites of Great Britain and those countries to run those countries badly. And so it became important whether you could quote somebody in Greek, and knew a Latin, something in Latin that you could say, things like that, proved you're educated. And so the place that people did archaeology was in Greece, in the areas associated with Greece, Egypt, and Rome, the classical civilizations, so-called. You know, they would try to prove that Troy really existed. Okay, some guy dug in Turkey to find Troy. They try to prove that Alexander the Great's homeland in the north really, so they did all this archaeology to substantiate many of the stories that were being stated in Greek, ancient Greek literature and theater. And so a lot of archaeology in that period had to do with what we call classical sites. Not archaeology doing the Maya, they weren't doing the Aztec, they weren't doing, let's see, China, they weren't doing all the civilizations that occurred in India or the Middle East. They were doing the classical sites. And they extended this over time so that they began, Babylon was mentioned in the Bible, so they do Babylon, the Assyrians. Eventually they got to the Sumerians, who were the earliest civilization in the world, and so on and so forth. But it was all to justify their own education and the fact that they were elites, that they know these things and other people didn't. They'd have a conversation with somebody and they'd know, oh, you don't know that. Well, you're not our kind of peeps, our kind of people. And so, it was very interesting. This became a tremendous field, and we do have it here. It came out of nowhere. Once there was Greek being taught, next thing you know, some Greek millionaire got his son a job teaching at Dawson by funding the classical study department. How do you get your son a job at Dawson? I'd never seen that in my whole life before. I thought, see, Jeff, they do this. I knew they did this at university. So they invented classical studies and he funded it. I was gobstruck at the time. I couldn't believe it. Little Dawson ends up with a classical studies department because somebody wanted to get their kid a job. So, we look at classics with a smile. We think it's a legitimate study, but its roots are rather limited. Because in anthropology, we study every type of society, not just the classical civilizations. In fact, when we study Greece, we're more interested in the types of societies that came before the rise of the city-states. Because that tells us something about what created them. And in ancient Egypt, it's nice to study people who, build a pyramid here and there. That's really great stuff. But we're more interested in some ways what came before. Okay? Because it's interesting, we've done enough on the pyramids to know that so-and-so built a pyramid, so-and-so did this, Atep 12 did that, what's his name did that, and so on and so forth. It's been done. Now we're interested in how did it get there? Why did it fall? And things like that. So, it's okay to be a classical archaeologist, but it really is ancient stuff. It really is kind of a field. And what went along with this is that the Europeans stole everything that wasn't tied down. Everything they dug up, they took home with them. The British Museum has got half the marble of Greece sitting in it that they want back, but they can't get it. Okay? The same with a lot of Egyptian stuff. And nowadays in archaeology, which isn't classical archaeology at all, there's a whole move to say, if you dig it up in a country, it belongs to that country. You don't steal it and walk out the door with it. Okay? And so, there's a kind of, there's kind of a tainted history in classical archaeology. They made Indiana Jones a hero. I almost fell off the chair. I first saw that movie. I thought, here's an archaeologist that's a romantic hero? God, most of them I know look like something they dug up, for Christ's sake, And the fact that he fought Nazis, I thought, well, that's kind of cool, but not very real. Most archaeologists would do anything to hang on to their archaeological excavations, They wouldn't fight anybody except the people that threatened their excavations, okay? So, that's the difference. He's a classical archaeologist. He's more interested in the goodies. He's more interested in a certain time that was legitimizing the upper class in Britain. They studied, they wanted dug up. And there was a whole school of people running out studying things that were mentioned in the Bible or mentioned in Greek myths to justify the existence of Christianity, to justify the existence of all the Greek stories and Egyptian stories. Okay? So anthropology studies it all. Doesn't matter if it's Chinese, Mayan, Mongolian, even Canadian we'll study. I mean, as dull as it can be, we can, we can study hockey stories. What the damn, what can we say? So, that's the difference. He was a classically trained, limited archaeologist type, and of course, we think of anthropology as much more expansive into all studies, all times. What is historical archaeology versus what is prehistoric archaeology? There's always a question on that, both because of the lecture I gave you, and because of, did we, see, where were, did I get very far in this? Where was I before I got talking this? 34, that's where we got. Okay, so now I'm 35 to 43. Anything you didn't get?
38.
38. A popular one not to get. Okay. There were, at one time, okay, this is the Carolinas when they were part of the British Empire before the American Revolution. The Carolinas. There was no North Carolina, no South Carolina. No basketball team in North Carolina beating South Carolina. No Duke versus North Carolina. They weren't even states. They weren't even universities at that time. They were called the Carolinas, and they would, it was one colony. Named, I think Carolina was named after King Charles or Prince Charles or something like this. And so the earliest agriculturalists, British colonists that were in the region, did not grow cotton. We all think, what did they grow on the south? Cotton. Everybody grew cotton. They did not grow cotton. They didn't grow tobacco, which of course is why Duke University in North Carolina are there. Tobacco money. That's why they have huge basketball programs. It's all based on tobacco money, okay? What they grew was very interesting, and they found this out by doing historical archaeology, not at the mansion where the plantation owner lived, okay, but in the areas where the African slaves lived. So they started doing archaeology with the people who were the labor and exploited and brought in from Africa in the earliest stages. And they found some very interesting things out. The slaves that were there made these plantation owners rich because they had come from an area in Africa who were the best rice growers in Africa. And so oddly enough, in this stage in the Carolinas, when it was part of the British Empire, not a separate state, not after the American Revolution, in this period, the biggest product being sold that was making huge amounts of money for the plantation owners in this earliest stage was rice. And when you think of the American South, you do not think of rice, okay? And those were the expertise of this particular group of slaves. They came in from a certain area, and they were the best rice-growing group in the whole of Africa, okay? And so quite by accident, I assume, because I don't think that slaves were bought, we only want slaves from there. I think they were bought, and what happened was it made the Carolinas rich, and the plantation owners rich. And we would have never known this if we hadn't gone and started doing the archaeology of the people that usually don't get the archaeology done. Everybody does the big buildings. Nobody does the buildings of where the people who are really doing the work are. And they begin to find these people were incredibly skilled at farming rice. Okay? And there's always a question on that, usually because everybody thinks that the only thing grown in the American South is cotton or tobacco. And of course, this is in a much earlier period, and we would have never known about that without the archaeology, because there wasn't a lot written about that in that period. Okay? Okay, what number is the question? 34? 38. Okay, what would it give evidence that these people were rice growers, and that the wealth of these plantation owners in the British colonial period was based on the fact that they actually had the best experts at growing rice from the African continent. And when you think of Africa, you don't really think of rice. I mean, when you think of other crops. So it's really quite an oddity that wouldn't be well known. Okay? Especially because tobacco and cotton became the two huge exports from the American South when they broke free from Britain after the American Revolution. Tobacco, by the way, is native to the New World. It's not, it's like tomatoes, potatoes. Without the New World, you wouldn't have these things being consumed in Europe. Okay. So, 38 to 43, anything you didn't get? Okay. 44 to 48, anything you didn't get? No? You're okay? Okay, so let me go through here quickly. Okay, what are the two definitions of archaeology? You should know what archaeology is defined as, but you're not going to get a question on it, okay? On whose culture do archaeologists focus? That one you might get a question on, 26. The three goals of archaeological research, well, is that not a perfect multiple choice question? One of these is not like the other. All I have to do is put down one correct goal and two wrong, or the reverse of that. So that's a possible multiple choice question. What are the three goals? You should know the difference between prehistoric archaeology and historical archaeology. And the difference is, prehistoric is before there is a written record, and historic is when there are written descriptions written down. Okay. Now, you should know from 30 to 33 what these things are. What an artifact is, the definition. What features are, what echofacts are, and what sites are. Artifacts are things that are man-made, and you discover them. They tell you things about the people that made them. Humanly made. Features are actually parts of structures that humans made, so features are actually artifacts also. But they are structures, buildings, fences, things that, huge things, bridges that people made. Echofacts, well, this is the interesting one. Collecting echofacts has proven to be a tremendous bounty for understanding previous periods. One of the ways to collect echofacts is to take a core sample. On Easter Island, if you looked at this picture on Easter Island, you would say, oh, there's Easter Island, and it's always been barren and just grassland. Okay? Because that's the picture we see today. So, what they did is they went to a huge pond that existed on Easter Island from the beginning of Easter Island, so this place where all the water gathers. And they went out into the middle of the pond and they did a core sample. They took a massively large pipe that went way up and they began to knock it down into the bottom of the silt at the bottom of the pond and drive it deeper and deeper under the pond, because the pond has all the things around washed into the pond and it piles up in layers, perfectly regimented, logical, time, you're able to tell it when it was put down, layer after layer. And so what happens inside the pipe is the material is pushed into the pipe in the exact layers that you find in the pond. And so when you take the core out, you can tell. You have a history of the whole island's weather and foliage, because you've got it all there. You've got all the pollen, all the things in each layer. And so they found out that that whole island was a tropical forest when the Polynesians first arrived. It wasn't like that. In fact, for 500 years, the tropical forest was the main feature on the island. It looked like every other tropical forest on a tropical island. But over time, they cut down the trees to burn them and use them. In order, they burned the trees to fertilize the ground so they could plant crops. It's a system called slash and burn. You have a tropical forest, you cut down a slice like this, you burn it, it fertilizes the soil, you grow your crops. When it gets unfertile, you leave it alone, let it grow back, you go to the next one, you cut it down, burn it, the ashes fertilize your crops. So you work around, and the tropical forest replenishes itself over time. It's a self-sustaining system until there are too many people. And when there are too many people, you do not allow enough time for these places to grow back. And so you are going back to old plots and planting too soon because the whole tropical forest is not grown back, and you're burning less and less on it because it's not growing back. And so over time you destroy the tropical forest, which is what happened on Easter Island. And so the height of the statues was when there was tropical forest and things were good. Eventually, those statues were toppled because the chiefs who they represent and got